What ancient battle in history was a slaughter due to one side bringing in shocking new weaponry? The Battle of Crug Mawr, 1136. The battle that introduced one of the most dominant weapons of the medieval age. The Normans had just steamrolled the mighty Anglo-Saxons, one of the great warlike cultures of their time, meaning the Normans were now thought all but invincible in open battle, and after a few years cementing their control over England, powerful Norman lords started to turn their attention towards little old Wales, a region of small tribal kingdoms. Sure, the Welsh had been ruthlessly defending their hills and valleys from invaders for thousands of years. The Anglo-Saxons had battled them to a stalemate, multiple times. Even the Norse and Vikings had tried and failed to establish settlements in the land of the dragon, for the fierce Welsh tribes were masters of their terrain and inherently warlike. But the Normans were like, bugger all that. Those bunch of sheep shaggers won't stand a chance against our mighty Norman heavy cavalry charging. So, a group of hardcore Norman lords, with the permission of the king, decided to invade Wales and set up shop. At first they were successful. These lords established estates and built castles along the border with England. They became known as the Marcher Lords, and after a few years they became filthy rich, building loads of castles, and founding powerful towns like Pembroke. I had to make this map to highlight the early Marcher Lords' progress into Wales. I'm aware it's not perfect, before all you map critics start chatting shit. This process was slow, for the small Welsh kingdoms routinely fought back, and while the Normans enjoyed a comfortable numerical advantage, the weaker Welsh tribes used effective ambushes and were supplied by the strong unconquered Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd in the mountains of the north. Then in 1135, King Henry I of England died while campaigning in Normandy, leaving his daughter Matilda as heir, and this sent shockwaves through the ranks of the Marcher Lords, who quickly pivoted towards England, instigating a succession crisis. Large numbers of soldiers were pulled from their tentative Norman holdings in Wales and marched to England with their lords to make sure no silly woman would be queen. I'm sorry, my lady, but the lords said you can't possibly rule because you are a woman. They suggested you take up embroidery and sent this rather lovely collection of fabrics and exquisite threads. Oh really? Well, we will see about that. Put that goddamn needle and yarn down, you imbecile, and fetch me my sword.
긴 머틸더.
Surprise cockface. How'd you like those embroidery skills? Empress Matilda, Lady of England, went on to wage war against her usurpers for the next decade, and eventually, her son and his line would rule England for generations, forming the Angevin Empire, the most powerful empire in Western Europe.
Right. Interesting detour over. Back to the epic battle.
While the Marcher Lords were off usurping Matilda's throne, a Welsh army attacked and wiped out a Norman force at the Battle of Crug, killing 500 Norman soldiers, and this encouraged the two great kings of Wales, one in the south and the other in the north, both unimaginatively named Gruffydd and Gruffydd, to gather their formidable retinues and begin a fierce fight back. The Normans had lost their numerical advantage, and their holdings were isolated. Strangely, the Welsh kept wiping out entire Norman forces, leaving no survivors, and this caused panic amongst the Marcher Lords, resulting in the powerful Lord de Clare rushing back to his holdings that were being overrun. Only, when Lord Richard de Clare tried to cross Welsh lands, his force was ambushed in the steep hills and completely annihilated. This once mighty lord and all of his heavily armored Norman soldiers were shockingly killed to a man. The Battle of Crug Mawr, 1136. Also known as the Battle of Cardigan. Owain Gwynedd, son of the King of Gwynedd, marched into the Norman-controlled lands near Cardigan with an army of 6,000 soldiers. These were drawn from the professional retinues of the two largest Welsh kingdoms. Robert Fitzmartin, commander of the Normans, had gathered a much larger Norman army, upwards of 8,000 strong, formed of Flemish infantry, local levies, and a substantial force of elite Norman heavy cavalry. The large Norman army formed up on the side of an odd-shaped hill just outside of Cardigan, taking up a strong defensive position with three deep ranks, the Flemish infantry at the front, the levies in the middle, and the renowned Norman cavalry drawn up behind and on the flanks of the hill. The sight of that much larger force of Normans, their flags billowing in the wind, with front ranks packed with well-armored heavy infantry and a large force of the dreaded Norman heavy cavalry that dominated the battlefields of Europe, drawn up on the flanks, must have been terrifying. Yet the Welsh army showed no fear, relentlessly moving forwards, towards the steep hill lined with Norman invaders. The Welsh army, predominantly heavy infantry, formed up into a single dense line, with a small token force of Welsh cavalry on the flanks. That Welsh army must have seemed desperate opposite the much this was when the Welsh introduced a weapon to the battlefield that would become legendary the world over, the weapon that would dominate the late medieval battlefields of Europe for the next 400 years, the larger Norman army, which held the high ground. The Welsh army began to slowly advance, and as it moved forwards, some 2,000 Welsh longbowmen separated from the main battle line, and once they were within 200 meters of the enemy, these scruffy men who carried longbows as tall as a man, knocked heavy ash arrows and unleashed an almighty volley into the front ranks of the Normans, who quickly began dropping in large numbers. The original Welsh warbows were ugly, unfinished-looking weapons, but astonishingly stiff, large and strong, and equally capable of use for long or short shooting. Gerald of Wales, 1146 to 1223. While the Welsh had used longbows on a smaller scale in ambushes against the Normans, this was the first ever large-scale use of longbows on a battlefield, and the carnage inflicted as these large 140 lb plus draw weight bows rained heavy arrows onto the unexpecting Normans was unbelievable. The Normans often used archers and had been on the receiving end of volleys before, but never anything like the longbows, which quickly decimated the front line of Flemish infantry. The Norman commander Robert must have been shaken by his sudden heavy losses because he ordered his elite Norman cavalry to prepare to charge down the hill. These Norman horsemen were the most feared force in Europe. They quickly rounded the flanks and formed up at a trot. This fearsome cavalry force of almost 2,000 heavily armored horsemen began to close on the Welsh lines, when suddenly the longbowmen switched targets and began pouring volleys into the densely packed Norman cavalry, breaking all cohesion and killing many, who fell and became obstacles for the cavalry behind. But the Norman cavalry wasn't done yet. They roared a battle cry and began to charge at full speed down the slope towards the Welsh longbowmen, who unleashed a finale volley before rapidly retreated between prepared gaps in the Welsh. That Norman charge crashed like a pitiful wave against a stout seawall. All power and momentum had been sapped by the withering longbow volleys, and before long the famed Norman cavalry became bogged down in a losing battle against some of the finest heavy infantry retinues left in Britain. With losses rapidly mounting, Robert Fitzmartin ordered his cavalry to fall back, but this merely resulted in disorganized retreat, with the Welsh cavalry running down the fleeing infantry and the longbows raining long-range volleys on the unarmored backs of those Normans capable of running for their lives. The Normans lost upwards of 3,000 dead, while the Welsh suffered negligible losses. Not only was this one of the largest battles ever fought in Wales, it was also one of the most one-sided battles ever fought in history. That battle on a hill near Cardigan, in West Wales, was one of the earliest examples of longbowmen used tactically on a medieval battlefield, and the result was nothing short of stunning. Within a few decades, the English began recruiting Welsh longbowmen as mercenaries, and by the reign of King Edward I, the longbowmen had become the core weapon of the English army and would go on to utterly dominate the late medieval battlefields of Europe.
Welcome to my channel Shadows of History. What were the unluckiest empires in the world history?
The Inca Empire, 1438-1533.
The Inca managed to construct by far the largest empire in the history of the Americas, and the largest empire in the world at that time.
In 1491, the Inca ruled the greatest empire on earth.
Bigger than Ming Dynasty China, bigger than Ivan the Great's expanding Russia, bigger than Songhai in the Sahel or powerful Great Zimbabwe in the West Africa tablelands, bigger than the cresting Ottoman Empire, bigger than the Aztec Empire, bigger by far than any European state. The Inca dominion extended over a staggering 32 degrees of latitude, as if a single power held sway from St. Petersburg to Cairo. Charles Mann. The Inca built one of the greatest imperial states in human history, and they did this in the space of less than 100 years. The Inca managed this, largely because of one man and his son.
The Tale of Pachacuti, 1418-1472.
Pachacuti was the youngest son of a petty king, who ruled a small kingdom in the valley of Cusco. From a young age, he impressed the nobility and his teachers, being undeniably intelligent and showing natural administrative ability, while clearly demonstrating combat skill. But his father had named his older brother as heir to the throne. Then one day, a much larger neighboring tribe attacked the small kingdom of Cusco. All seemed lost and defeat inevitable. So Pachacuti's father the king and his older brother chose to flee the capital. But Pachacuti would not leave his people. The young Pachacuti stayed behind and quickly organized the defense of his father's kingdom. He fought a savage battle against the invaders, and eventually, he was victorious, saving the kingdom. Peace was restored, and Pachacuti was named king of all Cusco, but his small kingdom was surrounded by rivals and the future looked bleak. Yet Pachacuti swiftly set about implementing changes. He designed the layout and rebuilt his capital city Cusco, reforming administration systems, ordering a network of roads to be built across his kingdom, and improving agriculture. When he had improved his military enough, the new king took his young son Topa Inca on a glorious military campaign. Together they conquered many of the neighboring kingdoms, including there would be invaders, and defeated all their enemies. What I found most interesting is that many kingdoms simply decided to join the Inca Empire, without the need for violence. The Inca expanded at such outstanding speed that Pachacuti and his son Topa have been compared to Philip and his son Alexander the Great. Pachacuti invented the bureaucratic structure used by the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, which means realm of four parts, improving the administration and management of his growing empire. He then set about codified Inca law and reorganizing the Inca religion, protecting the rights of all to worship different religions. It's now believed that Pachacuti himself ordered the building of Machu Picchu as his own estate. He is likely responsible for many of the vast agricultural structures built around this time. While Pachacuti carried out his extensive improvements of the Inca world, his son Topa received command of the Inca military and engaged in many successful campaigns, expanding the Inca Empire.
Pachacuti fittingly means earthshaker.
When Pachacuti died, his son Topa carried on his work and expanded the Inca Empire to almost its full extent, becoming the largest empire in the world at that time. With a population of around 14 million, that spoke over 40 languages and included a diverse mix of people that worshipped many different religions and territory that included every type of climate and terrain. What's most shocking is the Inca did this without the wheel, horses, knowledge of iron or steel, and they hadn't even developed the written word, beyond a system of knots on strings. The Inca also built some of the most impressive agricultural structures ever seen. They mastered irrigation and water management in unbelievably difficult mountainous terrain. The Inca changed their mountainous landscape. Across a vast empire, they established many vast agricultural districts. Documents from missionaries and Valera describe the Inca as master builders and land planners, capable of extremely sophisticated mountain agriculture and building cities to match. Incan society was so rich that it could afford to have hundreds of people who specialized in planning the agricultural uses of newly conquered areas. They built terraced farms on the mountainsides whose crops, from potatoes and maize to peanuts and squash, were carefully chosen to thrive in the average temperatures for different altitudes. They also farmed trees to keep the thin topsoil in good condition. Incan architects were equally talented, designing and raising enormous pyramids, irrigating with sophisticated waterworks. The Inca constructed the most mind-bogglingly extensive road network in all the Americas. This system covered over 25,000 miles of roads and trails, with approximately 2,000 way stations at evenly spaced intervals, including inns that offered shelter, food, and supplies. The Inca carved out the largest, most powerful and advanced civilization in the Americas. An empire which would have evolved and possibly lasted for many more centuries. Then some Spaniards turned up, riddled with diseases that killed millions throughout the Inca realm, crippling the world's largest empire. This once mighty civilization, with vast sprawling cities and millions of people, was all but wiped from existence by a mere handful of these strange people, who traveled in massive ships, wearing metal armor and wielding deadly weapons, unlike anything seen before. When the conquistador Pizarro wrote to the King of Spain about the Inca capital Cusco, he said, "It is so beautiful and has such fine buildings that it would be remarkable even in Spain." What is the craziest thing a human being has survived? Mary Vincent was a 15-year-old girl hitchhiking in California on her way home in 1978. Hitchhiking was a relatively common practice at the time. Larry Singleton was a 50-year-old freak. A car was parked there, big enough for all three girls, but he insisted that there was only room for one. The other two warned her that it looked suspicious, but she was tired and didn't want to wait any longer. She climbed in with him, alone. She felt something was wrong, so when he went out to pee, she tried to escape, but he saw her and hit her in the back of the head. He raped her and cut off her arms before throwing her off a 30-foot cliff onto the road. He left her to die, but Mary thought quickly. It had rained recently, and she used the mud to bandage her wounds to slow the bleeding. She felt tired, but knew she would die if she stayed there, so she tried for hours to reach the top. Naked and covered in blood, she walked 3 miles along the road hoping someone would come and help her. A car slowed down and passed her, and she became hopeful, but they continued on their way. A second car came by and picked her up. It was a honeymoon couple, and they took her to the hospital, where she was quickly airlifted to a larger hospital, where her life was saved. Mary is the strongest person I know.